Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Frank, and I'm Vice President of European Government Affairs at Microsoft, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Microsoft Center. Today we've got a special guest and book talk. Ambassador Sherman is Senior Consultant or Counselor at the Albright Stonebridge Group and has recently joined the Harvard Kennedy School as Director of the school's Center for Public Leadership. Wendy Sherman has had a long and distinguished career as a diplomat since she joined the U.S. State Department in 1993. In the Clinton administration, she was a key aide to Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, and she was named Special Advisor to President Clinton and Policy Coordinator in North Korea, managing, among other special assignments, negotiations with Pyongyang on nuclear non-proliferation. Ambassador Sherman has become best known as the United States lead negotiator in the multilateral Iran nuclear deal from 2015. In her book, Not for the Faint of Heart, Ambassador Sherman shares, I'd say it's a mix of a good sense, really a fascinating sense of what it's like to be in the room and part of the group negotiating a treaty, as well as advice on career, how to make a difference in public life, and the importance of having a cause behind what you're doing. And so please join me in welcoming Wendy Sherman.
So John and I agreed I would just talk for a few short minutes about the content of this book, but then we'll get into a dialogue and then get into a dialogue with all of you as well. I'm really delighted to be here, and I can't say enough about Microsoft. It's been a joy and a pleasure to do some consulting work with John and with his colleagues in Redmond to really try to make a difference, you know, whether you're in the private sector or the public sector, and I'm in both, or the NGO sector, which I'm doing also. It's about making a difference and trying to move things forward. And I give Microsoft a lot of credit because from the platform that you have as a business that has a business purpose and owes your shareholders a profit, you are trying to really get on top of something that's critical to all of us in our lives, and that is how you manage the cloud and how you manage this technology that is going to define certainly my grandkids' lives in ways that are unimaginable to most of us. So I really, really appreciate what you're doing, what the leadership of Microsoft is doing, you included, John, so thank you. It's always a thrill to be in Brussels. I totally came with an umbrella, which reminds me when I leave, don't let me leave without it, because London's not doing so well either. So much is happening here. And having been in London yesterday and spending at least an hour watching BBC and the Prime Minister's question period, and then coming here to the EU and hearing the other side of the story, I joked to a bunch of Harvard alumni last night that we should start a betting pool whether the American shutdown or Brexit get resolved first. It's a close call. Most people think the shutdown, but that's because you remember how we resolved previous shutdowns. The rules now don't exist. It's entirely different. So I hope you're right. Not that I don't care about Brexit, but the shutdown affects a lot of people that I care about because they're not getting paid. But I don't know whether that'll be the case because all the rules have gone out the window. And one of the reasons that I wrote the book to make the segue is that most of what we do in our families, raising kids, in our work life, trying to get on top of what you need to manage the cloud and artificial intelligence is not for the faint of heart. It takes tremendous persistence and courage, understanding of power, building a team, defining what success is, being able to deal with failure and learning from it. I tell particularly the Harvard undergraduates who have done everything right to get into Harvard, and now they think if they just keep doing everything right, life will be wonderful, that it just sort of doesn't work that way. and that they should each find a science student for two reasons. One, there's nothing in their lives that will not be touched by science, and they can't be afraid of it like I was growing up. And secondly, that for scientists, failure is part of the process. It's not pejorative. You can't learn how to make the next move forward unless you learn something from what doesn't work. And so the book is really a way to say, to do any of these very difficult things in life, whether it is to raise a child, which is very difficult, persists even after they're grown up, or to negotiate a nuclear deal with Iran, takes persistence. That deal really was begun by Europe and Europeans, the Germans, the French, and the British. In the early 2000s, Helga Schmidt, who is the great unsung hero of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action — we always think of lovely titles for the things we do, we diplomats. Who knows what a JCPOA is, right? That's why everybody calls it the Iran nuclear deal. Just remarkable. She'd been at negotiating with the Iranians for a decade before I ever got involved. And I got to deal with them for the 4 years that I was the Undersecretary for Political Affairs, which is the political director in the US system. And the first 2 years, Ahmadinejad was president. Saeed Jalili led the delegation. We traipsed all over the world, including a sandstorm in Iraq, and accomplished almost nothing for almost 2 years. Because Ahmadinejad really didn't want to do anything, which is a lesson for all of us. If the leadership is not there, if you haven't found that ripe moment, it's not going to happen. And you have to wait, or you have to pull the strings to try to create the environment so that that moment happens. But what did happen over those 2 years where we almost got nowhere is the other members of the permanent members of the Security Council — Russia, China, United States, United Kingdom, France, plus Germany, coordinated by the European Union — we all got to know each other really well and forge a team with a common objective, which was to make sure that Iran never had a nuclear weapon. And as a result, when we got to the real negotiations, we actually knew how to work with each other. We knew had to have a cigarette to be able to keep going. The Russians and the Chinese. We learned who had to have wine at dinner. Of course, the French. We learned who worked really well late at night and who was a morning person. All these things which help you to know your team to get anything done, to find the common ground to achieve anything. So the book does indeed try to take you inside, and the strongest thread in terms of negotiation substance in the book is the Iran negotiation and what happened and how that happened. But the book also touches on 3 other negotiations. North Korea, where we have had only very limited success, and why that is, and what we did, and how that happened. Now, of course, the President of the United States and Kim Jong-un are in love with each other, so everything's fine. I don't think it'll work, but nonetheless. Cuba, where we made substantial progress, but was very much an up and down process, and how we did that. Of course, that's headed in another direction now. And Middle East peace. There is not a president ever who has not come into office, of the United States, who has not believed that he — and they've all been he's so far — that he can solve this problem. And it is, I talk about it a lot, both in terms of failure and persistence, because if there was ever a set of negotiations that have failed and failed and failed, it is Middle East peace. And why is that? And what are the elements that weren't there to make that happen? So on the substantive side of the book, those are the themes and the threads throughout it. Happy to talk about any of it and any other negotiation going on when we get into the dialogue. But the book has another thread that runs through it, and that is my life. And how one learns what the elements are to become a good negotiator, to become a good worker, to become a good person in life, an effective person in life. And there are a couple of themes to that. One is we often talk about work-life balance, but we actually should talk about work-life integration. We bring our whole selves to work every day, whether we acknowledge it or not. What we do as a parent, what we do in our community, if you're a deacon at your church, all of these things are part and parcel of what you bring to work and what you bring home, for good or for ill, after you've had a bad day. So everything we are needs to come together. And when we are authentically, all of us, who we fully are, we are our most powerful selves. And so the book is written as this combination of personal and professional, because it's all one. The other couple of other themes are, I tell young people all the time, I wish them an unexpected life. My life has been so unexpected. I have a master's in social work. I was trained as a community organizer, and I was trained with clinical skills. Those clinical skills have been immensely helpful to me with dictators and members of Congress. So I use them all of the time. But my organizing skills, which are to be able to read an environment, see the entire landscape, figure out how to create a common culture, common ground, understanding the nature and the use of power. Power is a great thing when used well and for good purposes. But power in and of itself is not a bad thing. Social work and organizing taught me how to reach an objective, how to put a strategy together to get there. And so that core set of skills I've used as being a director of child welfare, I've used running political campaigns, and I've used as a negotiator. I've now taught every negotiation class at Harvard, the law school, the business school, the Kennedy School. I've never taken a negotiation course in my life. Most of you, I tell them it's still valuable for them to take it because they'll learn some things. And then they'll have to go out and do. Most of you in this room are negotiators with your 2-year-olds or your teenagers, or you're negotiators in trying to do a deal to get market access for Microsoft in a difficult environment, and you probably never had formal training in doing so. You've brought what you've learned from life and experience into doing it. And so the book tries to go through the elements that I think are important to be successful, from courage to understanding of power to building a team, understanding failure and what a definition of success is, and persistence, the real fundamental need for persistence. And so the last thing I'll say is this is a tough time for people like me in my country. I wasn't a supporter of Donald Trump's to be president of the United States. I worked my butt off for Hillary Clinton to be president. I was in New York the night she lost. It was devastating. And there are many times when I've thought, I'm old enough now, I've done enough, I can lean out. I don't have to keep leaning in. But I can't. At hard times, in difficult times, when there's a lot on the line, whether it's Brexit or a shutdown or a lack of leadership that we need in the world, or great anxiety on the part of people, which makes them turn in times of uncertainty to orthodoxy, autocrats, and sometimes fascism, is the time where we absolutely have to lean in and persist and try again and work together as a community to try to make a difference. So those are all the elements. Now I turn over to John. He can ask me questions, and then you all can too.
Just a couple, then we'll just ask for continue the conversation with everyone. But in your book, there's definitely a theme about the role of women. Mm-hmm. And one of your says, women, it must be said, have a strange relationship with power. We aren't afraid of it necessarily, but we seem more comfortable with informal power than institutional power. Can you elaborate?
Sure. I think that we are taught, we meaning women, or certainly I was early on, that our role, we define ourselves more often in relationship to other people than as the primary person out in the world. I told some of the women here at Microsoft in an earlier session today that I'm a big fan of Carol Gilligan, who wrote a book called In a Different Voice, that talks about really, and it's quite physiological, I'll leave that to your own imaginations, men, and I don't want to be reductionist here, there's a long continuum for men and women, but men tend to see themselves as out in the world supported by others. And women tend to see themselves in relationship to other people. And as a result, I did a study when I was in social work school of community organizations. Most of them were started by women because they wanted to get a traffic light so their kids could cross the street to go to school safely, or safe drinking water in their community. And as soon as donors arrived, grants started to come in, somehow or other guys ended up being the executive director. It's like the women were comfortable creating it, but not running it, not leading it, as if somehow they had to turn it over to you guys at that point. That's ridiculous. And I think that some of that has changed now. And some women are comfortable and some men are comfortable being the behind-the-scenes person, and that's fine. Everybody should be who they are. Not everybody has to be the person out in the world, men included. Sometimes you can be behind the scenes and be perfectly happy. But women do need to we need to push ourselves a little bit to get there. Two other examples quickly. I mentioned in the book, there's a Hewlett-Packard study that says that women believe if there's a job opening and there's a list of qualifications, they have to meet every single qualification, 100%. You guys think 60%, good enough, I'm applying for that job. So I tell women, apply for the job if you've only got 60%. Either you'll learn the 40% on the job or you'll do what the guys do. You'll never learn the 40%. And you'll define the job as the 60% and do it really well, and your boss will think you're terrific. And I learned this very fundamentally from Barbara Mikulski, who was a United States Senator, the longest serving woman in Congress ever.
And the first woman senator.
The first woman senator, Democratic senator, elected in her own right. And I managed her campaign for that position. And Barbara was 4 feet 11. And as I say, comfortably round. And people would say she doesn't look like a senator. And she'd say, she understood that togas didn't come in a size 14 petite, but this is what a senator was, and this is what a senator was going to be. She inhabited the role and said, I am a senator. I am defining what it is to be a senator. And she was immensely successful at it, and the most popular politician in the state of Maryland. And so it is really understanding and appreciating who and what you are and what you bring to the table, and defining the role as that. And the last example actually came from last evening. I was meeting with a group of Harvard alumni in London, Kennedy School alumni, and there was a Q&A, and so I'm just putting you all on notice now. I have a rule. Usually when I do Q&A, the first 3 questions are from guys, just invariably. And if by the 4th question a woman hasn't raised her hand, I say, I'm not taking any more questions because I know you have smart things to say until you raise your hand. And so I was talking, so that happened last night. And I was talking to some of the women afterwards, and they said they were thinking about it, and they realized that what they do is they don't raise their hand quickly because they're trying to formulate the perfect question in their head. Whereas the guys just raise their hand and they figure by the time they get called on, they'll have thought of the question, right? It's a confidence. It's a confidence that you'll get to the right place. And so these women were saying, we're going to challenge ourselves. We're just going to raise our hand. By the time they call on us, we'll ask a question. Will it be perfectly formulated? Who cares? It's not a test. It's not a test. So, we just have to struggle with this. It's a little harder for us.
Well, I want to stay on the theme and get you to tell one more anecdote that's in the book about women in the Situation Room.
Yeah. So here was Susan Rice was the National Security Advisor. Her two senior deputies, Avril Haines and Lisa Monaco, all women, extraordinary women, really tough cookies, smart as hell, really capable. And I'd often be in that Situation Room with them and really thrilled. Even with all of us in that room, we experienced what I'm sure every woman in this room has experienced, which is that Lisa might say something. The meeting goes on, not really acknowledged. 5 minutes later, John says something, and everyone says what a brilliant thought that was. Same thing Lisa said 5 minutes ago. So we began an unwritten rule. We actually didn't talk about it. We just began doing it. So when those things happened, and John said the brilliant thing that Lisa said 5 minutes ago, one of us would say, John, that was really good for you to reinforce what Lisa said. And sometimes John didn't even know what had just happened, but it didn't matter. It helped us support each other to say what we thought and get acknowledged for saying it.
Switching gears a little bit, I think Vice President Pence this week gave a speech where he called out a number of countries, including Cuba, North Korea, and others, for undermining the international, or seeking to undermine the international order that America has founded over the last 50 years. I was a little surprised by that formulation.
Yeah.
Where do you see American foreign policy going?
Oh, I hope in a better direction. We just have confusion at the moment. When McMaster was the National Security Advisor, he and Gary Cohn, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, did an op-ed which sort of set the frame for the Trump administration. It basically said, there is no community of nations. There are competing players, and the world is about getting advantage in that competition. That's a very different mindset from the transatlantic alliance that has been the bedrock of Western values since World War II. Mm-hmm. It's just completely different. It is a dog-eat-dog scenario. And that has driven the administration, that notion, and the notion, as the president said, of putting America first. Now, for those of us who are my age, who had parents who served in World War II, America first just reeks of anti-Semitism and fascism. He says he doesn't mean it that way. In many ways, Brexit is Britain first. Mm-hmm. And it all harkens to a sense of anxiety and uncertainty that people have. The best way I explain it in my own country, and I was part of the Pew Global Attitudes Project back in 2002 when it first got started, surveying people around the room, and my husband, Bruce Stokes, who several people in this room know quite well, now helps to lead that project. We surveyed 44 countries. Most of them were emerging markets, and people loved, back in 2002, what they got from globalization: better pharma choices, better food choices, American blue jeans. The Vietnamese loved, 90% of the Vietnamese loved cell phones. Only 10% of them at the time had them, but they loved them. But people were also afraid of losing their way of life and losing their identity. That notion has come home to roost in the developed world. So in my country, a 55-year-old white guy, and I'm married to a white guy, have been for 39 years. I love you all, but so don't take offense. in the middle of my country who had a manufacturing job, who made really good money, and that is gone, maybe to technology as much as trade, now is told to take a computer coding course, and after 2 years he'll make half of what he made before. His wife has to work now, and he never wanted his wife to work. Whether we think women should have a right to work or not, he never wanted her to. That was their deal with each other, but she has to work to make ends meet. He has 2 kids to put through college, and college is out of sight, even public universities. Healthcare costs are going up. Those nice people down the street who we always tolerated, they can get married now, and he doesn't know what that's about at all. And the people in his community don't look like him anymore that are moving into his community. And they don't go to his church. They go to the mosque down the street. And he doesn't know who he is anymore. He doesn't know who his community is or his country is anymore. He feels unmoored and unanchored, and he wants certainty. He wants things to be the way they were. And in my country, Donald Trump understood that grievance really well. And it's not to say he won the popular vote, because he didn't, but we have a strange system. So he got to be president of the United States. But he understood that grievance, and every single day he works that grievance. That's happened here in Europe as well, that sense of grievance. Obviously, migration being the greatest force here in that regard. And the irony of all of this clinging to sovereignty and to the way things were, is completely antithetical to the issues we all are facing, whether it is cyber or terrorism or AI or climate change or economics. These things cross borders. They don't really care about your border. So if we aren't in it together, we aren't going to get it solved. So I hope in my view, we are not in the right place. We are undermining Western values that have served us all immensely well. We all have to resist the desire to retrench. We all have it. We all have it, some more than others. Otherwise, as my dear friend, business partner, and once boss, Madeleine Albright, has said in her new book, Fascism, A Warning, that's where we'll be. And none of us wants to be there.
Can we talk for just a little bit about the personal side of the Iran negotiations, and then just the rapport that you build with people who disagree, but if you can get them to share a common mission of some sort. The book talks at length about your time in Vienna, trying to reach conclusion. And could you just...
Yeah, sure.
Not everybody here's read the book, so
sure. Sure. I hope you all do. But one of the chapters in the book is about common ground. To get anything accomplished in life, you have to find the common ground. You know, that Venn diagram, even if it's this small, where you can find a place together. The P5+1 and the European Union had common ground because we all believed that Iran should not have a nuclear weapon ever. And that objective, which we all shared fiercely, kept us together. It even kept us together on the day that Russia illegally annexed Crimea and put little green men on the eastern border of Ukraine. And I was livid and furious. And Sergei Ryabkov, who was my counterpart, is a really skilled diplomat. He and I worked on the Syria chemical weapons deal together. We know each other, came to know each other really, really well, worked very well together. We were in an informal setting, and I went over to see him. I felt I had to say something. It was so outrageous what Russia had done. And I went over to him and I said, "Sergei, what have you done?" And he looked at me, realized what I was talking about, and said, "Nothing is amiss," and walked away. And he walked away because he knew if he stayed, we would have a big fight, and that wouldn't serve the purpose of why we were in Vienna. He knew we were going to have to deal with Ukraine, but not in that space, in that moment, or we would lose all of the common ground that we had forged to solve this problem. It was a very good lesson, and another facet of all of this is, with the Iranians, I could not shake their hand. I'm a woman, and in conservative Islam, men do not shake hands with people who are not their wives or daughters or spouses or mothers. And it was awkward. We have a workaround, we women. We sort of go like this. As guys are shaking hand, we go like this. But if you're in a room full of men and you're the only woman and you go like this, you look like a Marx Brothers routine after about 2 minutes. So it's really awkward. And so one day, Abbas Arachi and Majid Ravanchi, my counterparts, and I were standing around, and I decided to try to find a little common ground, not because it was going to solve the nuclear deal, but it would make it easier for us to work with each other. So I raised this issue of not being able to shake hands, and I said, you know, I grew up in Baltimore, in Pikesville, in a Jewish community, and a lot of Orthodox Jews in my neighborhood, and I couldn't shake their hands either. Well, at first the Iranians were quite unnerved by this conversation. Obviously, since they deny the Holocaust and hope Israel's wiped off the face of the earth, not exactly their favorite conversation. But as we talked about it, it got a little less awkward, and they understood I was trying to find a common place with each other. They told me there was a Jewish member in their modulus, their version of a parliament. So it's a weird, really weird conversation, but valuable in creating humanity between us. And Abbas and I both became grandparents for the first time during this negotiation. And iPhones can be wonderful things, also pain in the neck, but wonderful things. And so we shared photos of our grandkids. We were just grandparents in those moments. We'd go in the negotiating room and be tough as nails with each other. It didn't stop us doing what we needed to do, but we saw each other just a little bit differently to try to find the common ground that might help us get to a deal.
Now, the Trump administration is withdrawing from the JCPOA.
Yeah.
What's your sense of what are the range of possibilities for the path forward?
It was really hard. We all knew it was going to happen, particularly after some of the folks left the administration who had been trying to hold on to the deal. So it wasn't a shock, painful, but not a shock. I'm very grateful to Europe for trying to hold it together. I have stayed in touch with most of my European colleagues, with Helga Schmidt most of all. And so I'm immensely grateful. I see the Iranians wherever we're in international meetings with each other. And when Zarif comes to New York, Javad Zarif, their foreign minister, I think everybody has tried to hold on to it. I think that if the Iranians were sure that a Democrat would become president and wanted to return to some version of the JCPOA, they will try to hang on. They may not be able to. Most people think, because you all probably know better, but most Americans think that because Iran has a supreme leader, that they have no politics, that the supreme leader just decides everything. Iran has a lot of politics internally. So whether their politics can sustain the deal for another 2 years, I'm not sure. There's a lot of pressure on those politics. So it is not inconceivable that it will fall apart over the next 2 years. But if it holds together, I think the next administration will want to return to it, but probably will have to do some reworking with the Iranians to get there, because although we in Iran never had trust in each other, still don't now, we did have respect for each other. I don't think you can get to a deal without establishing some respect. And we'll have to regain that respect again to move forward. It does not help that Iran keeps taking Americans and putting them in Evin prison. That's true of many of the countries here who also have citizens in Evin prison. I urge all of you, Jason Rezaian, who was an American journalist, Washington Post reporter, who was held in Evin prison for a very, very long time. His book has just come out called Prisoner. Washington Post has put it out, I'd urge everyone to read it and get a sense of how truly brutal. I have no illusions about Iran.
Yeah, I think there's a brief video on the Washington Post.
Yes, website.
Precisely on that.
Yeah.
Well, and one of the issues that for some people is difficult to understand is we reached an agreement with Iran, and yet we seem to not address other areas of malign activity. And could you just explain?
Yeah. So this was a very, very conscious decision to ensure that Iran never have a nuclear weapon would be the only thing we would negotiate. And here's the reason why. Iran didn't want to negotiate anything else, for starters, and didn't have the license to do so from the Supreme Leader or the Majlis. But secondly, and very importantly, if you try to do everything, you end up with the mediocre middle on everything. And Iran might have said to us, well, we'll give Hezbollah less money, but we want more advanced centrifuges. Or, okay, maybe we'll send less of our militia to Syria, but we want to keep the plutonium reactor being built. And so you don't reach the objectives on anything. Also, if we tried to negotiate everything, we'd still be negotiating today. It took us 2 years and 110 pages to have a deal that, according to the International Atomic Energy Agency, has been complied with now since it was implemented in 2016. We'd still be negotiating everything else. It's very, very complicated. And the last thing, which is sort of funny, is I met with the Gulf Arab states before and after every negotiating round. I met with Israel constantly. And the Gulf states said to me, make sure you only negotiate on their nuclear weapons because you can't negotiate on the region because we're not in the room, which made sense to me. And then as it looked like we were getting to success, the Gulf Arab states said to me, how could you come to this deal and not deal with all these other issues? So, you know, sometimes you can't win for losing in that regard. But I think it was the right decision by all of the negotiating partners to just focus. And the notion was if Iran had a nuclear weapon, their ability to deter our and our allies and partners' actions in the Middle East would be profound. We wouldn't be able to do anything. They'd really own the Middle East if they had a nuclear weapon. And the chances of an Arab-Persian war or an Israeli-Iranian war would be incredibly high. An Arab-Persian war, it's, you know, we could have taken out Iran's facilities. We had the technology to do that, but they would have reestablished them. You can't bomb away knowledge. They would have reestablished them underground and in secret. And taking military action might have set off a broader conflict, which would have been disastrous. So,
I just want to mention that when you left the State Department, President Obama invited you to the White House and awarded you the National Security Medal.
yes.
Which is a very high honor in the United States. And you had an opportunity to have lunch with him one-on-one for the last conversation while in your State Department role. What can you share with us about it?
Yeah, it was really phenomenal. I actually left the State Department on a Friday and packed up and drove with my husband to Cambridge. On Saturday I was going to be a fellow, not what I'm doing now at Harvard, but I was going to be a fellow at Harvard for a semester. I was a month late because of the Iran deal, but the president had invited me to come and have lunch with him one-on-one on the Monday after I had moved to Boston. So I got on an airplane and I came back, because you sort of, when the President of the United States asks you to have lunch with him one-on-one, you get on an airplane and you go back to Washington. And most people expected that we would talk about the Iran deal. the entire lunch virtually was about Syria. The president knew I had a different point of view than he did on some of the decisions he made regarding Syria. He really struggled with his decisions. I'm sure he'll talk about this a lot in his own book. And so we talked about it, and he wanted me to know that he was still struggling with these issues because they were very, very hard decisions. I thought we should have taken the strike. I thought it was one of David Cameron's political mistakes to go to the British Parliament for a vote. I thought it was, I understood why the president did what he did, but in my view, it went down the wrong path. The president also believes in the rule of law, which I do as well, and there were great concerns on his part that we did not have the legal basis for taking military action in Syria. We could bomb terrorists because Iraq had asked us as a sovereign country to intervene on their behalf to protect their border. But what was the international legal basis for the United States to intervene in Syria? I understood the slippery slope the president was worried about. I just would have wished he had done differently. So I think I tell that story in part just to let people know that these decisions are hard. They're really hard and really complicated. And when you're on the outside, which I am now, you can never understand everything that's going on or isn't going on in the inside. So we all have to have some measure of humility.
Great. So with that, why don't we, we've got some microphones, and the first question in the second row here.
Yes.
Question, comment.
I know. It was meant to be.
My name is Sabina. I work in the European Parliament. I've been there for almost a decade now. And as you may know, you may have heard, Steve Bannon is currently busy in Europe trying to organize the far right here, taking advantage of the fact that mostly young people, but pretty much everyone doesn't vote in European elections. We've had something like 13% of young people in some countries in Europe voting in the last election only, which is, I mean, it can be low, it can be very, very low. It brings into question the whole legitimacy of the elected officials. I'm personally running a project to try to get out the youth vote for the European Parliament elections this year in all member states. And I'm wondering, from your experience in campaigns and community organizing, what are your lessons, or what would you be able to share in terms of how to persuade people to vote in what I think is probably one of the most crucial elections for Europe?
Yeah. So the U.S. has abysmal voting records. The percentage of Americans who turn out to vote is breathtakingly low. I don't know what it was this last time. Better than it was the time before. The midterms were better. More people voted in the midterms than voted in the presidential election. So it's hard. I think one of the most effective things in this last midterm we had was young people registering young people to vote. One of the things that came out of the tragedy of the shooting at Parkland High School in Florida was an activist group of young people who are not only advocating for gun control or reasonable gun rules, but trying to register young people to vote, to have a say, because a lot of them were seniors and could vote for the first time. And they actually linked up with Chicago teens who face violence every single day, largely in our African American communities in Chicago, and really went on a voter registration. So I'm a real big believer in young people, engaging young people to get young people to vote. So I think that's very effective. And I think that in the US system, not the same here in Europe, who the person is matters. So when Barack Obama ran, he was just like a rock star for the youth vote. And he used technology in a way that had never been used before in an American campaign. And it was incredibly powerful. to getting people to vote. We've now learned that technology, sadly, can also be used to distort votes, as happened in our election and I think happened in the Brexit referendum as well. So we have to be mindful about how technology is used, and Microsoft has a Defense of Democracy project, as do many places these days, in trying to solve that problem and make sure the hard work that you're doing to register people to vote does not get perverted in other ways. So thank you for what you're doing. It's a phenomenally important thing.
Okay. We've got a question over here in the front, then we'll kind of come back this way.
Thanks a lot. I'm Julia. I work for the Youth Diplomatic Service. It's great to see you again.
Good to see you too, Julia.
I've got two short questions. The first one, you mentioned that famous op-ed, which I think for us was really sort of a symbol to show that this is not just Trump and his sort of idiosyncrasy to say, you know, America first, but there was an idea behind it, and this is that now we live in this dog-eat-dog world, as you said, this sort of Hobbesian context. So my question would be for you, how, as the US previously, and certainly the European Union still does, how does a sort of foreign policy that believes it's transformative, it's liberal, it's multilateral, how does it survive in a world where it's confronted increasingly with authoritarian tendencies, with a tendency to do things bilaterally or not even just unilaterally? My second question would be, you mentioned how setting priorities, how focusing on one issue was really the crucial thing that got the JCPOA done. And I think one of the reasons we're seeing at the moment a sort of paralysis of decision-making and an absence of leadership is because it's become so difficult to focus on that one priority, right? There's so much going on, so many crises, they're more complex, and also there's this deluge of information. So how do we prioritize in this kind of context, and maybe concretely, if there's one issue that transatlantic relationship should focus on, what would that be?
Well, I think the two are actually work together. We get out of where we are because each one of us takes responsibility for doing so. Things don't change only top down. They change bottom up. Most of the fascist leaders were elected. Hitler was elected, right? So it is about the polity. It is about what every citizen does every single day and what they demand of their leaders. So if people are anxious and uncertain and are looking for orthodoxy or autocracy or totalitarian leaders because they give them a sense of certainty and purpose, then we have to listen to that anxiety and offer better solutions for that anxiety than a leader who looks for reductionist answers to complex issues. And I would say your second question is reductionist. Nothing in life allows us to do one thing at a time. So while I was negotiating the JCPOA, as Undersecretary, I was responsible for every region of the world and all multilateral organizations. So even during the 4 years that I was the Undersecretary, I went to 54 countries, some of them many times, dealt with every crisis you can imagine. We don't get to just do one thing at a time. So it's not to undermine or denigrate your question about setting priorities. We need to set priorities, of course. But the world's a complex place, and what I think leaders have to do is give people a sense that we get that, and we're going to help you through it. And one of the great challenges I think we have, and I'm relying on John and the Microsofts of the world to help us figure it out, is I think we're all so far behind on artificial intelligence, on policy for artificial intelligence. It's going to change the workplace in staggering ways that I can't even imagine. Maybe, John, you can imagine, but I can't. I don't know enough to imagine it. But I don't know of a single government that's planning for it in all the ways that we should. And so the chance that we're going to get more autocrats, more totalitarian leaders, is sky high unless we do some planning and thinking and create safety nets and ways for people to get dignity if they don't have the job they've had all their lives. really tough work. It's a challenge for each one of us. It's tough work.
We've got lots of hands, so let's move along the front row and we'll go back. Well,
thank you. Thank you. Sorry,
yes.
Okay. You have been wondering which the shutdown or the Brexit would be solved first.
Yeah.
Both have got migration as a background. The shutdown and also Brexit, or the migration, according to Cameron, was also inter-European migration. It has become migration one of the main subject matters and the first overall subject in the European Parliament elections. It's the first time that people debate in European states, and they will be in the next European Parliament pro-migration, anti-migration groups, and maybe they would be from the various sides, from left and right. So, and with your obvious experience in security policy, if you were asked now for an incoming administration to give advice how to tackle this migration over the world and also with the implications of security, what would you say, and how would you manage?
Immigration in the United States is really not a problem. The number of people who were coming over the Mexican border into the United States has gone down constantly. There are more families coming that used to come, but there's really a net negative migration. It's quite frankly made up, and it is, the data does not support those who say that there are caravans of thousands of people coming to overwhelm us. It's just not true. So one of the challenges we all have, and technology both helps us sort this and also brings us so much information we sometimes don't know what the truth is. There has a narrative has gotten going, particularly in some segments of our society, that all of these people are coming to get us. It's ludicrous. It's not true. And so we have to find ways to share facts in a way that people hear them. And so in the United States, I mean, I'm not going to presume to talk for Europe. I don't live here. I'm not part of the European system, so I'll talk for what I know. So in the US, the anxiety is about people coming who don't look like me, don't act like me, don't go to the church or synagogue that I go to, and are going to take my job. And, you know, one of the greatest ridiculous statements are all of these people in Minnesota or Wisconsin who were told that these immigrants were going to come from Central America and take over their vacation house on the lake, and they wouldn't be able to get back into their house in the summer when they wanted to get to the lake. I mean, really? But this became such a narrative, it actually took hold in some communities as if it were true. So we have a job to do to figure out how to use information, how to use social media, how to use media in general to find that common ground of facts, of what is true and what is not true, and what anxieties are real and how to address those anxieties. Now, the one thing I will say about Europe is I don't think it escaped anyone that when Chancellor Merkel said she'd take 1 million people, it startled folks. It scared people. And perhaps she should have said things in a different way. I can't make that judgment. I don't know the circumstances well enough. But I think leaders have to help people understand as I said, most of the toughest problems in front of us don't care about borders. They go across borders, whether you want them to or not. And if there's reality that we're worried about too many people coming in ways we cannot manage, then what do we need to do to help those people stay where they came from? There is no project right now of sufficient size. I had dinner last night with former President of Mexico, Carlos Salinas, and so we talked about Central America and what to do about it. There's no real good dialogue going on to figure out how to help Central America solve its problems or the resources to do so. So that mothers travel thousands of miles with their children because they're afraid if they stay, particularly in Honduras, their children will die. What mother wouldn't do that? So we have a lot to unpack here.
Okay, we have a question here and here, and then we'll come back. But in fact, let's take 4 questions. Since
you have to give me a piece of paper.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay.
Ambassador Sherman, Wendy.
Yeah, hey,
I'm
John.
John Wiles, and of course I haven't fully formulated my question yet. But it's something along the lines of to thank you for an extremely interesting analysis. It was never going to be anything else coming from you. But it is actually both inspirational in a somewhat bleak setting, if I can describe it. And as you know, many of us over here are very preoccupied about the future of the transatlantic relationship. You've described, if you like, some of the social and economic origins of the rightward drift here and in the United States, the shared characteristics. What do you think now are already going to be the lasting consequences for the transatlantic relationship of the process we're now living through?
Great. So here, then we'll go back.
Kurt Geisert from Backbone Consulting in Germany. It's fascinating to listen to you. You both mentioned North Korea. We have in Germany World Championships of handball right now, and there's a joint team from North Korea and South Korea. 1 year ago, in the Winter Olympics in South Korea, we had a joint team in ice hockey, and the International Olympic Committee did all to achieve that. How important, in your eyes, are such sport issues for the relationship with North Korea?
Great. So here and here, and then.
I have the mic.
Okay.
Yes. Hi, my name is Cristina Borreganescu. I work for the European Commission. I do foreign affairs for Europe's neighbors. But my question has nothing to do with the transatlantic relationship or anything like that. And I would like to start by making a little comment about the book. I haven't gone through all of it, but I found it inspiring and very interesting. And I'm looking for further inspiration. One of the issues of my generation, I think, is to finally close the gender gap. I still think we have a big issue with that, with having women in positions of power and so on and so forth. So I think a lot of women my age, we discuss this. We have some frustrations and anger and rage in terms of the inequality, but what can we do? One of the things that I've started doing is to talk about the feminine experience to men who would listen. But I don't know how, if you could have some points, some ideas of things that we can do to try to push this. Thank you.
It's on.
Yes. I just want to thank you for your comments about the silence of women or not being heard. I really appreciate it. But I was wondering, I'm older, I grew up when there was separation of church and state in America, and I find that that is almost an unknown concept now, and I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Okay, that's really interesting. What a wide range of questions. In terms of the lasting consequences for the transatlantic relationship, painfully, I think there will be. I think that, you know, as I said with Iran, I never had trust, but you had to have respect. We actually had trust in the transatlantic relationship. We trusted each other. We thought we shared the same values. We were on the same side. We worked together to solve difficult problems in the world. And I think a lot of that trust is gone. And so I think whatever happens, it'll have to be built up again. And I think that we have a deficit of leadership. We do. And part of the reason I went to be the director for the Center for Public Leadership at Harvard Kennedy School is kids come from all over the world, and I want the next generation of leaders to emerge. And thought maybe I could be helpful in some regard in that way. You know, I think whoever was going to be president of the United States, if Hillary had won the Electoral College, not just the popular vote, she was going to have had some of the same challenges, some of those same anxieties, and certainly uncertainties. And the institutions that we have since World War II needed refreshing. Whoever was president, whoever is chancellor, whoever is prime minister. So we have some work to do to figure out how to bring those institutions into the 21st and, quite frankly, the 22nd century, which I won't be around for, but to think in those broad terms, particularly given things like AI, which will just change how life is. So lasting consequences, sadly, yes. Repairable, yes. But there are deficits in leadership and deficits in the institutions that we need to meet those challenges, and that's work we have to do no matter what. Sports, I think sports is terrific as an element of moving an agenda forward. Sports and culture. One of the things I did in the case of Cuba is negotiate the Baltimore Orioles being able to go and play in Cuba, and the Cubans coming to Baltimore to play. I just think it is a place where you can break, we all know about ping pong diplomacy with China. So I think it can find some common ground, open up a bit of humanity. It's an element, it's an element. It's not the be all and end all, but I think it's a good thing, for sure. Closing the gender gap. Your rage, your frustration, your impatience are all good, but, and, maybe it should be and, not but, it is about persistence. This has been my whole life, right? And we're still not there. Things that are culture, that are socialized, that are part of the anatomy of humanity, take a staggering amount of time to change. And I have a daughter who's 35, and she is raising 2 sons, 2 little boys, at the same time that she says, I've had enough of male privilege over already. So I get it, right? But she also is raising these 2 little boys and trying to raise them to be the kind of men that she wishes all of her peers already were, right? So, yes, talk to the men that you think can hear you. I said to some women earlier today, I would not get a group of them together because groupthink goes on and you might end up being overtaken by their frustration and anger. But if they're individual guys who you think could get it or understand it, yeah, share your perceptions. But most importantly, have a support group of other women so you can validate yourself and know you're not nuts. And that can tell you when it's okay. When I was a chief of staff for then Congresswoman Mikulski, there weren't many women chiefs of staff on Capitol Hill. So there were 5 of us, Jerry Farrow's chief of staff, Mary Rose Okar's chief of staff, Sandy Levin had a woman chief of staff, and then a woman who'd been very involved in political campaigns. We met once a month at each other's houses. You weren't allowed to cook, only Chinese carryout. We just helped each other out. I had told then Congressman Mikulski that I wanted to get pregnant. So if she was going to hire me, she needed to know somewhere along the line I was going to get pregnant. And once I got pregnant, then another woman in the group felt she could. And these were in the days where there, trust me, were no lactation rooms, right? You had to, if you were going to pump milk, you had to do it in the ladies' room. So very different world. So just persist. It's not going to all happen, sadly, tomorrow. It's going to be your life. But I think you probably have the stuff to keep at it. Separation of church and state. One of the things that Pew, in the polling they've done, discovered a long time ago is that in Europe, well, put it the other way. Americans believe that you have to believe in God to be moral. More Americans believe that. That's not true in Europe. Europe has a very different view of religion, God, and morality than Americans do. America is an incredibly religious country, which seems bizarre, right? Because it was also a country, and many states were founded on the basis of religious freedom, right? So my state of Maryland, where I grew up, Catholics moved there because they wanted religious freedom. But we're a very religious country. So what we are seeing now, this overreach, in my view, about religion, comes from a pretty indigenous place. It's just gone to quite an extreme, in my view. You have less of an issue, or at least historically, over here when it comes to church and state and religion. So we have to work at it and not have people feel that they can't have their religious beliefs. They can be affirmed, but the state stays out of it. It's going to be hard in my country for a while.
There are many more questions, but not we're out of time. And so Wendy's going to stick around. She's happy to sign books, have conversations for a bit. And thank you all for coming today. And please join me again thanking Wendy.
Thank you all.